What did we learn from our study of Exodus? This is the question that we seek to answer today as we conclude our study of the book of Exodus on walking through the Bible.
Honors of his word, the glory of his cross.
We have now come to the 164th and final episode in our study of Exodus. If you missed any episodes or would like to rewatch this series, you can find all of them at www.eastendchurch.org by searching under the Media pull-down menu for the W.T.T.B English podcast link. So having now completed our verse-by-verse study of Exodus, it is a good time to reflect upon what we have learned. Back in Lesson 1's introduction to the book, we stated that one of the purposes that God had Moses to write this book is to show his faithfulness in keeping his promises. In our study of Genesis, we found numerous times where God promised either Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob that he would make them a great nation and that they would receive the land of Canaan. And while Exodus doesn't end with Israel receiving that land yet, it sets the stage for the fulfillment of that promise. However, the book of Exodus does show us the fulfillment of some of the promises to Abraham. In Genesis 12:3, God promises Abraham that he would make him a great nation. What did this promise mean? Well, certainly part of that promise was that they would have a large population, for it would be difficult to have a great nation with only a few people. God further explained this promise in Genesis 15, verse 5, when he told Abraham that his descendants would be as the stars of the heavens, innumerable. When God made that promise, Abraham had no children, not even Ishmael yet. At the close of the book of Genesis, Israel, when they entered Egypt, only numbered about 70 people, depending on how you count them. Hardly a great nation. However, the book of Exodus begins by telling us that God had blessed Israel and their numbers grew rapidly. Notice that it was God who blessed them. This appears to mean that Israel was exceptionally fruitful. Couples today know how difficult it can sometimes be to have children, but that didn't appear to be the case here. Families were large, so large in fact that the Pharaoh of Egypt was afraid that Israel would soon overpower the nation. The first way he tried to stop this was by enslaving them. Certainly he thought if he made them slaves, not only would it hurt the people physically, but it would leave couples little time for sex and so less children. Pharaoh's plans were frustrated here, I believe, by the providence of God. So when his initial plan didn't work, he then commanded that all the male children from the Hebrews be killed. He first sought to do this by using the midwives, but when they refused to go along, he commanded all male children be thrown into the river. Chapter 2 introduces us to a man and his wife who would be the parents of Moses. They defied the orders of Pharaoh and saved Moses by placing him in a basket and putting him in the river. He is found by Pharaoh's daughter, who then raises him as her own. But even though Moses could have lived a life of luxury and perhaps been raised up to be Pharaoh one day himself, he chose not to do that, for he was concerned for the well-being of his people. When he saw the brutal treatment of some of the Hebrews by an Egyptian taskmaster, he killed the taskmaster, which ultimately led Moses to have to flee to Midian. 40 years passed in Moses' absence, and the treatment of Israel by pharaohs were only getting worse. God, however, saw the affliction of his people, and when the time was right, he called Moses out of Midian to lead the people out of Egypt into the promised land. About 430 years had passed since Israel had come to Egypt, and about 700 years had passed since God's original call of Abraham from Ur of the Chaldees. Why God waited this amount of time cannot be determined with certainty, but a few things do come to mind. First, God prophesied in Genesis 15:13 that Abraham's descendants would be in a land that is not theirs and serve them 400 years. So if God's prophecies were true, this would come to pass. Second, it would take some time for a nation to grow from one man to a large nation that we see in Exodus. And third, it would allow Abraham to put his faith in God and not himself in order for God's promises to be fulfilled. At the time of Moses, the time of the captivity had now elapsed, so it was time for God to act on his promises, which of course he did. The Pharaoh of that time was a hard-hearted man and took 10 plagues from God before he would let Israel go, but God was stronger than Pharaoh, and he did bring his people forth from Egypt. And time again throughout their journey to Sinai, which we have determined was in Saudi Arabia, God proved to them that he would preserve them so that they could eventually conquer Canaan. When it looked like they were trapped by the Pharaoh at the Red Sea, God parted the sea, and they crossed on dry land. When they didn't have water, God provided them water. When they didn't have food, God provided them manna and quail. God was faithful, even when Israel was not, such as when they worshipped the golden calf. Apart from the history found in the first 19 chapters, the rest of the book lays out God's law given to Moses on Mount Sinai, as well as the specifications for the building of the sanctuary. There was much detail given to Moses concerning all of these things, and while we're not under this law today, it is important to study this, for it will show us that God demands obedience from his people. God is holy, and he will not accept anything less from us. Now, the only way we can become holy is through God's grace, but the only way we receive God's grace is through our obedient faith. When Israel didn't obey God's law, they sinned and suffered the consequences, and the same is true today. The book ends with the completion of the tabernacle and God showing his approval for what they had done. That God can be pleased should be a comfort to us, that God will be pleased with us as well if we obey him. With that, we conclude our study of the book of Exodus. The Lord willing, in the next episode, we will be returning to the New Testament and begin our study of the book of Mark with an introduction to that book. We hope you'll join us for that discussion as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.